The carriage rattled uncomfortably along the road as I gazed at the passing countryside, the rhythmic clattering of hooves and wheels reverberating on the track. My journey from London to the rather remote estate of my old friend and colleague, John Sinclair, Professor Sir John Sinclair to give him his proper designation, had been long and somewhat arduous. Yet although fatigue gnawed at my bones, my high spirits anticipated reuniting with my enduring ally, who I had liked and admired ever since our Oxford days studying medicine together, many years now past. I used to make this trip routinely, taking every opportunity to avail myself of Sinclair's famous hospitality and participating greedily in the excellent food, vintage wine, sport and conversation which came with it. But with the passing of time and onset of various professional, and in my case familial, responsibilities, I nor he could spare the time that was available to our younger selves, which made each visit we were able to arrange all the more cause for celebration. It was as the dying sun neared the horizon, firing its vivid rays across the hills, that the imposing facade of Sir John's sprawling home hove into view, and the carriage at last crunched to a halt upon the driveway. I tipped the coachman and made my way to the front door where he had left my weekend bag. I lifted the heavy door knocker, bringing it down with a deep resonance which echoed within. A few seconds later, Harris the butler greeted me with his usual composed smile, but as he took my bag and bid me across the threshold, there seemed a compromise in his welcome. It was more formal, and perhaps a degree cooler than I remembered. And as he led me through the labyrinthine, dimly lit corridors to the study where Sinclair awaited me, I felt the faint drag of melancholy upon my humour. Entering the room only redoubled the feeling. Sir John Sinclair, usually bright and composed, appeared pale and drawn, his typically jovial countenance replaced with an air of solemnity. "My friend," Sinclair greeted me, rising from his chair with a weary half-smile and offering his hand to shake. "I'm afraid our reunion is marred." "Really?" I inquired. "How so?" Perturbation rose within me suddenly like an unexpected tide. "What has happened, John?" Sinclair's gaze was haunted as he delivered the news. "James Humphreys is dead. He passed away just last week." "Humphreys?" I whispered. "How?" Our mutual friend and fellow physician had, as I understood it, been in his prime. And although Leif had not dealt him as advantageous a hand as Sinclair or I, to the best of my knowledge he was happy and healthy. In his last letter to me, he had written excitedly of an advancement he had made in germ theory, one that he was sure would finally seal his reputation. "Officially the cause was heart failure," Sinclair replied, pouring me a drink. "But in truth, I fear something more sinister." "Murder?" I gasped as I took the tumbler. He swallowed. "There are superstitious whispers in the village, but I examined the body, and I believe it was done with his own hand. With poison." I sank into the nearest armchair, digesting the information and absorbing the shock. Old Humphreys. Dead. "I would have messaged sooner, but I thought it best to tell you in person," said Sinclair. "Quite right," I murmured. Then a thought occurred. "When is the funeral? I should like to attend." "Impossible, sadly," Sinclair replied. "The family wanted a small private service, involving only immediate family. He is buried in the church grounds less than 2 miles from here." "I'd like to pay my respects," I said, firmly. "Of course, we shall go first thing in the morning." I nodded, but then hesitated. "Couldn't we go now? I'd rather do it sooner than later, or else it will dog my thoughts all evening." Sinclair acquiesced, and within half an hour, with the light fading, we had thrown on our greatcoats, summoned Sinclair's driver, and reached the village church. He stepped down from the carriage and bid me to follow him through the clustered arrangement of old and new graves to a plot recently filled, surrounded with fresh earth. As he did so, I perceived just the faintest reticence in his demeanour. This I put down to the emotional weight of the occasion, and gave it no further thought for the time being. Yet I could not tell whether it was the fading light and falling temperature, or the feeling of being surrounded by the dead, that chilled me as I approached the gravestone bearing Humphrey's name. There was a sensation in my heart other than shock and sadness, and though I quietly admonished myself for childish fancy, I could not suppress the bubbling up of fear within me. As I watched in silence, Sinclair stooped to rearrange some flowers that had been blown over by the wind. As he replaced them next to Humphrey's gravestone, I murmured, almost involuntarily, "I wish he was still here." It seemed such a pointless, obvious view and such strange phrasing that I flushed with embarrassment, but I'll never forget the change in Sinclair's face as the words left my lips. His eyes enlarged and his mouth cracked open into a disturbed derangement, as if he too was being overtaken by some terrible sensation. He coughed resonantly, almost choking, as if to rid himself of the feeling, and stood abruptly. "It'll be dark soon," he said. "We should leave." I watched wordlessly as he strode away, without even the merest backward glance. I paused a moment to pay my final quiet respects and crossed myself before following on. The journey back was in silence, the sky darkening and ominous clouds gathering overhead, and dinner was seasoned with only the most perfunctory snippets of conversation. I had taken on a few new clients and the family was doing well. He had won yet another prize for his contributions to medical science and accepted new patronages. It was when we had retired to his drawing room for brandy and cigars, the fire in the hearth doing its best to mitigate the chilling effect of the storm brewing outside, that I started to feel what I can only describe as unwell. Sinclair had launched into a lengthy discourse on the principles of a new approach to germ theory and antiseptics, which had recently earned him such acclaim. Germ theory, the same field Humphreys had alluded to in his letter. As I listened, nodding and interjecting where I felt I could, the ill feeling washed over me, and my perception of the drawing room began to alter. Its features, the walls, furniture, the fireplace and framed pictures, all at once began to move, at first very subtly, inching this way and that. I directed my eyes to the portrait of Sinclair which hung over the fireplace. It depicted him as a bold and benevolent man of science, but as I watched, his features melted away, replaced by those of... Could it be? Yes, it was James Humphreys. At first, this was merely a trick of the flickering firelight, but the figure in the painting coalesced into a clear, precise image of my poor, dead friend. It appeared to move within its frame, its eyes raging with a piercing intensity. The expression altered too, from Sinclair's one of solemn determination to that of bitter, vengeful hatred. The eyes narrowed, the brow furrowed, the lips were tight and turned down over gritted teeth with a scowl of revulsion. It was a face that spoke of a desperate, violent desire to right a wrong. To my horror, the spectral portrait locked its eyes on me. Then it turned slowly to Sinclair, who continued his monologue, seemingly oblivious to the turmoil happening around him. As I watched, petrified, cold, and rooted to my armchair, Humphreys raised a painted arm, somehow protruding out from the picture, and uncurled an index finger in the direction of Sinclair. I had only a moment to contemplate the meaning of this gesture when my hallucinations entered a new phase. The room began to spin, slowly at first, but then quicker, the fixtures and furniture carouselling around me with such velocity that I had to grip the arms of my chair. Before long I couldn't take any more, and squeezed my eyes tight against the feeling of intense nausea, pressing my teeth and praying for the awful event to pass. Thank heaven, then, that the sensation began to subside as quickly as it had begun, and at length I felt able to open my eyes. The room was as normal, except that Sinclair was gone, and I was alone. Something like relief washed over me, though I was breathing heavily and sweat soaked my shirt as if following vigorous exercise. It was as I reached for my handkerchief that a faint movement caught my eye, drawing my attention to the grand sash window on the wall opposite my armchair. The wind had worsened, and in the distance over the dark hills I saw the faint flash of lightning, followed seconds later by an ominous thunderclap. It was as a second flash ripped through the sky that I noticed something that made my blood run cold. There, not 40 feet from the house, stood the figure of a man, his back to the battered trees, rolling countryside, and incoming storm. Another flash and he was closer, perhaps now 30 feet. I could not see his features, but he was deathly pale and wore what appeared to be a formal suit, his arms unaccountably crossed over his chest. He stood in a stiff, awkward stance, not moving, just staring, his mouth set tight and eyes aflame. Another flash, and the phantom was 20 feet from the window. Now I could see for certain that I was the subject of his captivation. He peered through the gloom directly into the drawing room, into my eyes, and I felt, into my very soul. A final flash and a clap of thunder so loud that I jumped, allowing a whimper to escape my lips. I looked about me for a weapon and spied the poker in the hearth. But as I began to rise, the figure, that awful spectre, was at the window. He uncrossed his arms, and with his face still fixed upon me, pointed in a painfully slow indication to the drawing room door. Then the vision, who I knew to be the ghost of James Humphreys, uttered a single word, which sounded like the guttural, rasping exhalation of a pained last breath. Him. My next recollection was the bang of the drawing room door and the sharp tang of ammonia in my nostrils. Sinclair was standing over me, a small bottle of smelling salts in his hand and a solemn look on his face. "He's back," he said to Harris, who was standing behind. I blinked and rubbed my eyes, then sat forward to gather my composure. "What happened to me?" I asked. "It was something akin to a hysterical trance," said Sinclair. "I couldn't bring you out of it. You were gone for several minutes." I glanced past Sinclair towards the sash window and the grounds beyond it. He followed my gaze and returned a look that mixed confusion with concern. "You kept repeating the same word," he continued. "Him, him, him. What were you imagining?" I looked at him, knowing a terrible new thing. The next morning, as agreed, I left first thing and began the long journey back to London. I had claimed illness, but as my carriage cleared his mansion's boundary gates, I knew I would never see Sinclair again. But I couldn't possibly anticipate the turn of events which ensued. A week later, I was in my study reading the morning paper when I chanced upon the news that made me sit bolt up and spill my coffee. The headline read, "Eminent physician dies in mysterious circumstances." The body of Professor Sir John Sinclair, the story went on, had been discovered in his drawing room, slouched in an armchair. Police suspected heart failure, but there were two odd circumstances accompanying the death. One, a portrait of Sir John had been wrenched off the wall, torn, and lay broken upon the floor. Two, despite it being a cold November evening, the room's large sash window had been left wide open.